What if Lyanna Stark was betrothed to Rhaegar Targaryen, and Robert Baratheon was the one who took her? Brandon Stark rides to Storm's End to free his sister. He challenges Robert to single combat outside her window. 90 seconds later, Robert is standing over Brandon's body, genuinely begging him to get up. That's not rescue. That's a war nobody can stop now. Let's get into it. The torches had burned down to stubs, and Aerys Targaryen had not moved from the throne in 6 hours. He sat with his long yellow nails hooked over the arms of it, and he was counting. Not coin, men. His son had married a Martell, and Dorne had 10,000 spears. His son had summoned every great house in the realm to a tourney at Harrenhal, and every great house had come. His son had ridden past his own wife and his own father, and laid a crown of winter roses in the lap of a girl from the north, and the whole realm had watched him do it, and the whole realm had gone quiet in the way a hall goes quiet before the knives come out. "They are saying it was a slight to the princess," said the soft voice from the dark below the dais. The new one, the eunuch from the free cities, arrived not a fortnight past, and already the only man in the Red Keep who told the king things. "They are saying it was only that, a young man's foolishness, nothing more, your grace." "And what else are they saying?" Varys let the silence do its work. "I could not repeat such things." "Repeat them." "They are saying," the eunuch murmured, as though the words pained him, "that a man who wishes to gather the great lords of the realm to his side, and cannot summon a council to do it, needs only to summon a tourney instead." A breath. "I only tell you what is spoken in the wine sinks, your grace. Men in their cups are cruel to their betters." Aerys turned his head. In the torchlight, his eyes were wet and very bright. By the hour the sun came gray through the high windows, the king had the whole of it laid out before him like a map, and every road on the map led to Sunspear. The girl was nothing. The girl was a curtain the boy had thrown up to hide the thing behind it. It was Dorne. It had always been Dorne. His son had wed himself to spears and princes, and now meant to pull his father down off this throne. And there was only one way to cut a poisoned limb from a body before it killed the rest. You did not fight Dorne. You unmade it. The septon they brought was old and frightened, and would say whatever words were put before him. The grounds were medical, and they were true, which was the thing that made them monstrous. Elia Martell had very nearly died, giving the realm its prince, Aegon. The maesters had said plainly she would bear no more. And a crown prince, Aerys announced to a court that did not dare to breathe must have sons. So the marriage that had 2 children was unmade in a single afternoon with ink. And the man whose marriage it was stood at the foot of the throne and was not asked one question. Rhaegar did not love Elia. He had never once in his life been cruel to her. He watched his father take his household apart, the way a man watches a house he raised with his own hands come down in a fire, knowing the shape of every beam, unable to lift a hand to any of it. And he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say to Ares that Ares could still hear. They put Elia and the children on a ship for Sunspear before the week was out. "Why are we going on a boat?" Rhaenys asked him on the quay, 2 years old and delighted by the gulls wheeling over the mast. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's patience, and she tugged at his sleeve until he bent to her. "Papa, why are we going on a boat?" Rhaegar Targaryen opened his mouth to answer his daughter, and found that he could not. That same grey morning, in a solar 1,000 leagues to the north, a different man read the other half of the king's design, and had no trouble at all with his answer. Rickard Stark read the decree twice. Lyanna of House Stark to the Crown Prince Rhaegar, the north bound to the Iron Throne by blood, the wardenship of the north secured for 100 years and more. His hands shook as he set the parchment on the table, and any man who knew him would have understood at once that the shaking was not fear. It was the whole ambition of his life arriving at once, and finding him unready for it. He did not send it to his daughter. He sent it to his maester. The acceptance was written, sealed, and gone by Raven before Lyanna had even come in from the yard, before she knew there was a thing to accept or refuse. And somewhere over the black water of the neck, in a cold sky that belonged to no house and no king, the raven, carrying the north's joy south, passed within a wingspan of the raven, carrying the very same news west, to a lord on the far, storm-battered coast. And neither bird knew the other was there, and neither man yet knew what the other would do. At storm's end, the letter broke a table, 3 chairs, and the forearm of a serving man who had done nothing but stand too near the wall when it came. Then Robert Baratheon went quiet, and that was the part that frightened Stannis. He had watched his brother rage his whole life, the way other men watched weather. You found cover, and you waited, and it passed over. But Robert sat now in the wreck of the solar, with the crushed parchment still in his fist, and did not shout. And a Robert who did not shout was a thing Stannis had no map for. He had been promised Lyanna Stark since he was 18 years old. In the private country of his own skull, He had already wed her 100 times, already got sons on her, already grown old beside her in this very castle, with the grey sea breaking below the windows. And the man who had crowned her at Harrenhal, in front of the whole realm, in front of him, in front of her own betrothed, had now been handed her by the stroke of a mad king's quill. There's no fighting it. Stannis stood in the doorway, 19, and built for the carrying of bad news and little else. A royal command voids a betrothal. There's no law you can appeal to. There's no man you can call out, and no field you can win it on. It's done, and it was done lawfully, and I'll not stand here and tell you it wasn't, because you'd know I was lying.
Robert looked up at his brother with an expression Stannis would remember for the rest of his life. There was nothing in it he recognized. "Get out," Robert said, quietly, almost kindly. "Get out, Stannis." 1,000 leagues to the south, in the water gardens where the sun came down like a benediction and the children of 100 noble houses shrieked and splashed in the pale pools, Oberyn Martell read the same news, standing very still on the terrace, and broke nothing at all. That was how the whole of Dorne understood how bad it truly was. When the Red Viper went quiet, men made their wills. Behind him, Rhaenys was chasing the wet nurse in circles round the fountains and howling with laughter, and Aegon slept in his basket in the shade, and neither child knew yet that they had been made bastards-in-law that week, and then unmade again, or that their mother came home tomorrow, a discarded thing. A princess of Dorne, set aside by a northern king to feed a northern girl into the bed that had been hers. Patience, Duran spoke from the shaded chair he did not rise from, would rarely rise from ever again. Evidence. The long road, brother. There is a way through this that does not finish with our house on a pyre and Dornishmen dying in the bone-way. There is always a way through, if a man can bring himself to wait for it. "How many years of patience," Oberyn asked without turning, "is my sister to spend being a thing they set aside?" Neither of them said the word. Both of them were holding it in their mouths like a live coal, turning it, tasting how it burned. And neither Martell in that green and dappled garden had the faintest notion that the man who would set the whole realm alight over Lyanna Stark was not a prince, nor a king, nor a Dornishman with a grudge, but a lord of the Stormlands with a warhammer and a heart that had just been broken in two. At Winterfell, they told her at supper. Not asked, told, with all 3 of her brothers at the board and her father beaming down the length of the table, like a man who had just taken a tourney's champion's purse. Brandon laughed first, because Brandon laughed at everything, and raised his cup the length of the hall to her. "Your Grace," he said, grinning wide, "Gods be good, little Leah, queen of the whole bloody realm. They'll have to teach you to curtsy. They'll be at it for a year." Ned did not laugh. Ned watched his sister's face and saw the thing that happened to it, the way it went smooth and still and closed, the way a door swings shut in a draft. And he opened his mouth to say some word to her, any word, and found that he had none. Lyanna Stark set down her spoon and asked her Lord Father's leave to go, and no one at that happy table thought to stop her. She went out to the stables in the dark. She did not weep. She stood with her forehead pressed against the warm neck of her gray mare, and breathed in the smell of horse and straw and cold iron, because in the turning of one page she had stopped being a girl and become the single most valuable object in Westeros, and in 4 days they would put her in a wheelhouse and send her south to a wedding no one had asked her to want. 11 days after that, on a wet gray stretch of the King's Road, a man with a hammer would be waiting for her in the trees. It happened in the rain south of the Trident, and it was over in less than 4 minutes. 20 riders came out of the tree line, where an instant before there had been no riders at all. The royal escort was 30 strong, and expecting no one, because who in all the 7 kingdoms would dare fall upon a wedding party riding under the crown prince's own banner? They died in the mud without ever understanding it.
Robert Baratheon came through the heart of them, like the storm his house was named for, the great hammer swinging in long, flat arcs. And it was not a battle, so much as a thing that was happening, to men who had not agreed to be part of it. Not all of them died easily. A captain of the escort, a big man, quick for his size, got inside the swing of the hammer and put the point of a sword through the meat of Robert's shoulder before he'd finished turning. And for the length of one breath, Robert Baratheon was off balance in the mud, with a blade in him and death standing at his elbow. Then he closed his gauntlet on the man's throat, and the hammer came up short and ugly, and the captain's quickness did not matter anymore. Robert straightened, breathing hard, the rain washing pink down his arm, and went on. He killed 11 men in all. He had met most of them. One had fostered his own squire 2 summers past. He did not think about a single one of them for even 1 instant, because he had not come to that road to fight. He had come to open a door. The wheelhouse stood in the middle of the road, with its curtain drawn tight against the weather. Robert let the hammer fall from his hand into the mud, seized the door with both his fists, and wrenched it wide. And every version of this moment he had built and rebuilt across the whole long ride north had ended the same way, with her weeping into his chest with the relief of it. She came out of that wheelhouse with a knife. She'd had it hidden in her boot the entire way south, and she opened his forearm to the white of the bone before he had understood she was armed at all. And then she was past the wound and screaming up into his face in a voice they heard a full mile back along the road, that she was not a horse to be stolen, that she was not a prize, that she was not a thing to be taken off the road by whichever man had decided that week that he owned her. 3 of his own men got their hands on her at last, and it took all 3, and one of them she bloodied too. Robert stood there, bleeding into the rain and aching with it, with the love of her, with the whole terrible rightness of it. "You don't understand yet," he said it gently. He meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. "Leah, listen to me. I'm not stealing you. I swear it. I'm taking you home." It was the single most honest thing Robert Baratheon said in the whole of his life. It was also the exact instant he lost her, wholly and forever. And he was the only soul on that road who did not know it had happened. He let one man live. He did it on purpose, grandly, with the open certainty of a man who has never once in his days believed himself to be in the wrong. Because a man who has done nothing shameful has nothing to hide from anyone. He hauled a shaking young guardsman up out of the mud by the collar and told him to ride hard for King's Landing and carry a message into the Red Keep itself that Lord Robert Baratheon had taken back only what had already been promised to him under the eyes of gods and men, and that he would treat with his grace the king as one honest man treats with another, as an equal. He believed in his heart, standing there in the rain, with his own blood running off his fingertips, that this was the honorable course, that any reasonable man would see it so. 11 days later, that same guardsman knelt on the flags of the throne room and repeated it, word for word, exactly as Robert had said it, before the wet and shining eyes of the man who sat the Iron Throne. And Aerys Targaryen began to laugh. He laughed until the guardsman went white and forgot the rest of his words. He laughed until the courtiers stopped whispering and the great hall went cold around him. He laughed the way a man laughs when the whole of the world has finally, at long and blessed last, arranged itself into the precise shape his madness had always sworn to him it would. A great lord in open revolt, a royal bride stolen bleeding off the king's own road, treason you could hold in your 2 hands and weigh, and he did not stop for a very long time. She woke in the finest chamber in all of Storm's End, and its one door opened outward, and only outward, and there was a man standing beyond it at every hour of the day and night.
Robert could not for the life of him understand why the flowers did not work. He brought them every morning, cut fresh, still wet. He brought her horses from his own stable, the best blood he owned. He had sent men galloping ahead to Winterfell before the ambush on the road had even happened, and they had come south with her own saddle, her own longbow, the light riding mail she had worn in the north, so that when she came at last to her new home, some part of it would already be hers, and hers alone. He had arranged it all, like a man arranging a surprise for a woman he loved, in the past reason, because that is exactly and precisely what he was. "You'll come round to it," he told her, filling the doorway with his shoulders, the grey rain hanging behind him like a curtain. "You'll see, in time. I'll make you happy, Leah. I'll make you the happiest woman in the 7 kingdoms. I swear it to you on my father's grave." He told her that he loved her, plainly and sincerely, 4 separate times across those first grey days, and not once in any of them did he mark that she never gave him back a single word. In the story that Robert Baratheon told himself, the only story he had ever been able to tell, this was the chapter where he saved her. He had told it to himself so many hundreds of times that the other version of it, the one where she loathed the sight of him, simply had nowhere left inside his head to live. So she told it to him herself, in the plainest words that there were. "I did not want Rhaegar." She stood in the middle of the fine, cold chamber, and she did not raise her voice, which was worse than if she had screamed it. I did not want you either. I have never once wanted a single piece of any of this. And you stand there believing you are different from my father and different from that madman on his ugly chair, but you are not. There is no difference between the three of you at all. Not one. Every one of you decided where I was to go, and not one of you ever thought to ask. I'd have made you happy, Robert said, and for the first time there was something raw moving under the words. You'd have made me a whore in my own castle. She watched it land on him and did not look away from it. That is what you are, Robert Baratheon. Everyone in the whole of the realm knows it. Everyone but you. It went into him the way the knife had gone into his arm, only deeper. And this time it did not come back out. Of all the wounds Robert took across the whole of that long war, and he took a great many and dealt out more, that was the one that never once, to the last gray hour of his short life, stopped hurting him. That night the supper tray came up the stairs, and it was no servant who carried it. Stannis Baratheon set the tray down upon the table and stepped back from it, and stood there at rigid attention like a man delivering a report to his commanding officer. He did not sit. He did not soften one word of what he'd come to say. What my brother has done is against the law, he said. I have told him so to his face. I will tell him so again tomorrow, and every day after that, until it stops or until I do. A muscle worked once in his jaw. But you will understand me clearly, my lady. If this castle is set upon, I will hold these walls against the whole of the realm and everyone in it, because Storm's End is my brother's seat, and my duty does not trouble itself to ask me what I happen to think of my brother. Both of those things are true at once. I'll not pretend to you that they aren't, only to make the food go down easier. I don't know how a man would even begin to do that. Lyanna Stark looked at this rigid, joyless, grief-faced boy of 19, standing to attention over a supper tray in the middle of her gilded prison. And she understood two things in the same drawn breath.
That she had found here at the bottom of the world the one honest man in all the Stormlands, and that he was the precise and exact reason she was never, ever going to be allowed to leave. Robert's letter to the Eyrie asked for the swords of the Vale, and it did not so much ask as assume them, in the way that Robert Baratheon had assumed every good thing his whole life long. Jon Arryn read it through twice. Then he did the hardest thing he ever did in all his long years. He was an old man who had raised two boys not his own by blood, and he had loved the elder of them, the loud one, the bright one, the one who filled a hall to its rafters simply by walking into it, the way he had somehow never quite managed to love his own cold bones. And now he took up his pen with a steady hand, and he wrote back to that boy that he had done abduction and murder upon the king's own road, that there was no cause beneath heaven, no torn betrothal, and no wounded heart in all the world that could make those two things lawful, and that if the girl were not set free within the turning of the moon, then Jon Arryn would himself bring the whole gathered strength of the Vale of Arryn down upon the walls of Storm's End, with his own 2 hands upon the pole of the banner. He wept while he pressed his seal down into the hot wax. He sealed it all the same. For every other lord in the realm, it was not even a hard decision to make. Hoster Tully had 1 daughter already promised to Brandon Stark, and a second to spare besides, and not the smallest earthly interest in bleeding the Riverlands white over a Storm Lord's stolen bride. Mace Tyrell had the largest host in all of Westeros, a border that ran right up against the Stormlands, and a nose for the winning side of any fight that had never, in his soft life, once failed him. He began the mustering of the Reach before the ink was even dry on the king's summons, and he did it cheerfully, the way a man volunteers eagerly for the very task he already knows he is about to be handed anyway. And at Casterly Rock in the west, Tywin Lannister did nothing whatsoever. He did not write to the king. He did not write to Robert. He did not raise a single banner or send a single raven or speak 1 word aloud on the matter. And the doing of precisely nothing from that man in that particular hour was, without question, the most menacing thing that anyone did in the whole affair. He sat in his high seat above the western sea, and he watched a mad king and a stolen girl and a realm sliding down into war over the wants of 1 lord's broken heart. And he waited. Tywin Lannister had learned long ago, and paid dearly for the learning, that the patient man is in the end simply handed the things that the eager man has to bleed for. Robert Baratheon had 1 castle, 1 hammer, and the whole of Westeros turning its face against him. And at the Eyrie there was a boy of 18 with 2 commands, pulling him clean in half. His foster father told him plainly, and to his face, that this was treason, and that shared blood was no excuse for it, under any law of gods or men, and that a Stark heir who rode south for Storm's End would be riding against his lawful king. His own father's ravens came flying in to tell him the very opposite, that his sister was locked in that castle on the sea, that Brandon was already calling the banners of the north, and that no Stark that ever drew breath had sat still by the fire while another Stark was kept in a cage. Ned Stark listened to both of the men who had a claim on him, and then he he did neither of the things they asked. He did not raise a banner for Robert Baratheon. He did not turn his horse north for Winterfell to raise one against him either. He took a single horse from the Erie's stables in the black hours, and no men to ride with him, and no leave granted from any living soul. And before the gray of the next dawn had touched the mountains, he was already down upon the high road, alone, his breath and his horse's breath smoking in the cold, riding hard for the south. Because he had decided, somewhere in the middle of that one sleepless night, that before the whole of the wide world gathered itself together to kill his oldest friend in all the earth, one single person in it ought at the very least to go and talk to the man first. No one saw him go, and by the time Jon Arryn stood at dawn before the empty stall and understood at last exactly what his ward had gone and done, the boy was already a full day down into the Vale, riding hard and riding alone toward the one castle in all the 7 kingdoms that every last army in the 7 kingdoms was, at that very hour, already marching to surround and to burn. The gate of Storm's End opened for him, and it opened because Robert ordered it opened, laughing. He came down into the yard with his arms already spread wide, before Ned had so much as swung a leg down from the saddle, and he was grinning the way he had grinned when they were boys together in the Vale, with the whole of the world laid out in front of them, and nothing yet spent. In Robert Baratheon's understanding of things, there was only ever one reason on earth that Eddard Stark would ride 2,000 leagues alone through a gathering war, and that reason was loyalty. And loyalty meant agreement, because the two had never once stood apart in Robert's head for the length of a single thought. He caught Ned up bodily off his feet in front of 200 men of the garrison and roared his name into the wet gray air. "I knew it," he said, holding him back at arm's length, gripping his shoulders, searching his face like a man reading good news twice to be sure of it. "The whole bloody realm turned its back on me, every last craven one of them. And I stood on that wall, and I said, Stannis, mark me, I said, Ned will come. Ned always comes." He laughed again, and it echoed off the stone. "And here you are." On the wall above the yard, Stannis Baratheon looked down at his brother, embracing the man who had ridden all this way to take everything from him, and understood precisely what was coming a full hour before Robert did. Ned went to his sister first. He had not known what he expected. Not this. She stood at the window of the finest chamber in the castle, thin now and very straight, and when she turned to face him, there was no relief in her at all, only a terrible level of steadiness that frightened him worse than any weeping could have. "You've come to take me back to Winterfell," she said. It was not a question, and it was not hope. "So father can hand me on to the next one who wants me, or south to the prince, so that he can simply receive me, like a parcel that's run late upon the road." She shook her head, slow. "I'll not go from one man's castle into another man's bed, Ned. Father sold me. Robert stole me. Rhaegar will thank his gods for me, and never once think to wonder what it was I wanted. You are the only man living who has ever bothered to listen to a word I say." Her voice did not so much as waver. "So listen to me now. Is there one man, one, in all the 7 kingdoms, who would let me choose? Ned Stark, who was honorable and 18 years old and had no power in all the world, could not say yes to her. He went to Robert that night in the solar, and he said it plainly, the way he said all things. Let her go home, kneel to the king, take the black and go to the wall. They'll grant you that much. I'll ride to Jon myself and beg it on my knees if I must. Do that, and you live. Refuse it, and every man in Westeros comes to this castle to watch you die for nothing at all." Robert stared at him for a long moment. When he finally spoke, every scrap of the joy had drained out of him, and something colder had come into the room to take its place. "Whose side are you on?" The fire cracked in the hearth between them. Ned did not look away from him, and he did not soften it. "My sisters." The silence after those 2 words lasted a very long time. 13 years of shared silence stood in it. The veil, the long summers, the 2 boys who had been nearer than brothers of the blood ever are, and all of it came quietly to its end there in that one stone room. Then Robert turned his face away to the fire and told him in a voice gone flat and strange to get out of his castle before he did a thing that the both of them would carry down into their graves. Ned rode out through the gate at first light, and behind him he heard it grind shut on its chains, and he knew in his gut that it would never open for him again. 11 days later, riding hard for the north, with nothing settled and everything already lost, he met his brother Brandon, coming the other way, down the King's Road, at the head of 400 mounted men. Ned argued with him for a night and a day. He laid the whole of it out the way their father had taught them both to lay a thing out, coldly, in its proper order, sparing nothing and softening less. The royal host was already upon the road, 3 weeks behind them at the very most. The walls of Storm's End had never once fallen to any army in the history of the world. 400 horses thrown against the strongest castle ever raised in all of Westeros was not a battle, and could not be made into one. It was an offering, nothing more. They would die in the mud beneath those walls, and it would change not one thing, save only that Lyanna would be made to watch it happen from her window. Brandon listened to none of it. He had never once in the whole span of his life believed that a thing he wanted badly enough could simply fail to come to pass for him. It was the thing that made men love him, and the thing that was about to kill him, and they had always been the same thing, wearing two faces. He reached down and clapped his brother on the shoulder, almost gently, the way a man humors another who frets too much over nothing. You sit here and wait on leave from kings, Ned, if that's what gives you comfort of a night, he said, hauling himself back up into the saddle and gathering the reins. Stark girls don't rot in cells, while stark men stand about in the road deciding things. He wheeled the horse to face the sea and the castle above it. I'm going down there to get our sister. He rode to the gate of Storm's End, and he threw his head back, and he bellowed up at the walls for Robert Baratheon to come out and die. And Robert came out. That was the tragedy at the very heart of it. Not strategy, not any cold calculation, nothing a man could argue with or reason his way around afterward. Joy. He had been shut up inside a box of stone for weeks on end by an entire realm that would not deign so much as to speak with him. And now, here at last, at the very foot of his own walls, stood one honest man willing to face him plainly and fairly in the open. Robert Baratheon loved nothing on the whole of the gods' green earth the way that he loved a fight offered to him clean. It lasted 90 seconds. Brandon was fast, and he was furious, and he was good. A great deal better than Robert had reckoned on. The first exchange very nearly ended the whole thing the wrong way round. Brandon's blade came slashing in beneath the great arc of the hammer and opened a long red line across Robert's ribs. And for the space of one held breath, every man on the wall believed he was watching his lord die in the mud. Robert grunted, gave ground, took a second cut across the meat of his forearm.
Brandon pressed him hard, scenting it now, driving him back step by step toward his own gate. And then Robert stopped giving ground. The hammer came up. It came down once. When it was finished, Brandon Stark lay flat on his back in the mud beneath the window of the sister he had ridden all this way to save. His chest caved in beneath the ruin of his breastplate, and Robert Baratheon stood over the wreck of him, saying, "Get up." Genuinely saying it. Over and over, the word coming out of him is thick and clumsy and useless. Because he had not wanted this. He had wanted a duel, and a yield, and a laugh at the end of it, and a cup of wine shared afterward with a man he would gladly have called a friend. He had wanted, as he always wanted, the story in which everyone he liked came through alive.
And he had instead just killed Lyanna Stark's brother in the mud below her window. And there was no turning of the world in which he could take one instant of it back. And he knew it, kneeling there in the wet, telling a dead man to stand up on his feet. Above him, on the high wall of Storm's End, Lyanna was screaming, and 200 leagues to the north, into a cold and empty solar, where a lord had lately read another letter with hands that shook, a raven came down out of a gray sky to Winterfell. Aerys wanted the Stormlands salted down to the sea, and every Baratheon that still drew breath burned alive in the yard of their own castle. Rhaegar took the host himself, precisely so that not one word of that would ever come to pass. It was the one thing he still knew how to do. Set himself bodily between his father and the thing his father hungered for, and take the whole crushing weight of it down onto his own back. So he rode south at the head of an army that had been raised to fetch him a bride he had never asked to have, to avenge the death of a brother good he had never once met, in the name of a marriage, the unmaking of which had shattered a household inside which he had been perfectly content. He was not a villain. He was not a man in love. He was only a son, carrying out his mad father's decree, and hating every single league of the road that unrolled beneath his horse, which made him, entirely against his own will and to his own faint disgust, the most sympathetic man in the whole of the war. And riding at his right hand, the length of that road, was Eddard Stark. It was the most agonizing thing the whole war ever produced, that one image of it. The brother of the girl waiting at the end of the road, riding in the very host that had been sent to collect her, in an army marching in good order to kill his oldest friend in all the world, and doing it because both of those things were his duty, and his duty was the only thing that Ned Stark had left in his hands to hold on to. He did not speak much on the ride. He was not often asked to. Rhaegar found him one night at the ragged edge of the camp, sat apart from the cook fires in the dark, and did not offer him a word of comfort, because he was far too perceptive a man to insult another with it. They gave me no choice in any of it either, the prince said quietly, looking out at the black country where the road ran on to the south. My wife, my daughter, and my son. My whole life was taken apart and rebuilt in a single afternoon by a man I was powerless to gain. He was silent for a while. You and I are the only two men in the whole of this host who truly understand what it is to be moved across a board by another's hand. Every other man here chose his side and rode to it gladly. You and I were only placed on ours. Ned said nothing to him, but neither did he get up and walk away into the dark. And Rhaegar marked that too. It was the beginning of a friendship that neither of the two men wanted, and that neither of them, in the end, would prove able to help. The banners came in one by one as the host ground its way south. Mace Tyrell brought the whole flowering strength of the Reach and enjoyed the outing enormously. Hoster Tully brought the Riverlands, prompt and dutiful, and thinking always of his daughters and their matches. Jon Arryn brought the Vale, and rode near the front of it, and could not for the life of him bring himself to meet the eye of any man in that host, least of all the boy he had raised, who now rode within it, against the other boy he had raised, who waited behind those walls. And Dorne sent a single raven, and the message it carried was 4 words long. Rhaegar read it alone, at his own campfire, twice through, the way another man had once sat and read another letter twice. Dorne is not well. No spears, no prince, no apology offered, and none owed. Doran Martell would spend all the rest of his years defending those 4 cold words to men who spat that they were cowardice, and he would never once trouble to explain them to any of them, because the whole of the explanation was simply that his sister had been set aside like a soiled thing to make room in a marriage bed for the girl that this host was marching to go and collect. Rhaegar folded the little scrap of paper along its crease and understood, sitting there in the low firelight, that his own father had just cost him the one kingdom in all the wide realm that had ever truly and wholly been his own. 80,000 men came at last to the walls of Storm's End, and there they discovered the walls of Storm's End. The first assault cost 4,000 of them, and gained a single scorched patch of churned mud at the foot of the curtain wall. They came very near to gaining more than that. For one long and terrible hour on the second day, the scaling ladders held fast against the seaward wall, and a knot of reachmen actually crested the parapet and got their boots down on the stone, close enough that the men watching in the camp below forgot to breathe, close enough that the whole war might have ended there and then on that wall. The garrison threw them back off it into the gray sea, one by one. After that, the second assault was not attempted at all. Storm's End had been raised by Durin God's grief in the dawn ages of the world, to spite the very gods that had drowned his wedding guests. And in all the long turning of years since, the gods themselves had never once managed to bring it down. The entire gathered might of the 7 kingdoms was not about to accomplish in a single season what the gods had failed at across an age. So the host did the one thing that had ever worked against those walls in all of history. It sat itself down in the mud in a great ring around them, and it began to wait. What had been intended as a punitive campaign of a single season became, without anyone quite deciding it, a siege. And a siege is not a battle. A siege is a place. It has to be lived inside of. Within the walls, Robert Baratheon was a lion shut up in a box. There was no one left to fight, and no one left to charm. And those 2 things were the only things he had ever truly known how to do with other men in all his life. His garrison worshipped him and would die to a man for him, and could give him back nothing at all but their worship. His hostage despised the very sight of him, and told him so afresh each day with the whole weight of her silence. And his brother came and stood before him every single morning, rigid and gray and unbending, and told him plainly and without any heat at all that what he had done was wrong, that it had always been wrong, that it would still be just as wrong come the morrow, and then went and carried out his duty upon those walls flawlessly, regardless. Outside the walls it was scarcely any easier. Rhaegar's host ate the Stormlands down to the bare brown dirt, and as the long months turned over one into the next, the great lords began, quietly, each in his own tent, to ask one another how long exactly a king could expect grown and belted men to sit rotting in the mud over the fate of a single girl. And Ned Stark spent 14 months of his young life staring up at a window he knew his sister stood behind, and was not permitted in all that time to once cross the churned ground between them and speak a single word to her. Then, in the 14th month of it, King's Landing fell silent. No orders came south. No supply came. No answer came to any of the ravens that Rhaegar sent flying north, one after another, into the quiet. And when word did at long last come, it did not come upon the wing of any bird. It came on a rider, a man who had ridden 4 good horses to their deaths beneath him to reach that siege camp, and who fell out of his saddle before the prince's tent, gray in the face and swaying on his feet. The king had summoned Lord Rhaegar Stark to King's Landing. To answer, the summons read, for his son Brandon's unlawful assault upon a royal castle.
Ned read it over Rhaegar's shoulder in the thin gray morning light, and he did not understand it. His father was the king's own dearest ally, the architect of the whole design, the very man that Aerys had raised up above all others. Then he looked at the prince's face beside him. And Rhaegar Targaryen, who had known his father for 23 years, who had learned by heart every shape that the madness took behind those eyes, had gone the exact gray color of cold ash. Rhaegar Stark rode to King's Landing at his king's command, having spent 2 full years as that same king's most loyal and most useful ally in all the wide realm. Aerys had spent those same 2 years watching his son take command of the entire host of the 7 kingdoms and hold it in the field, watching him bind the north to the Iron Throne and befriend the Warden's own heir and receive fawning ravens from every great lord in all of Westeros.
And Aerys, who had been listening to the voice inside his own skull since the day they shut him in a cell at Duskendale, had arrived at last somewhere perfectly and flawlessly logical, and altogether and irretrievably insane. The Northern Alliance had never once been his own idea. He saw that with terrible clarity now. It had been the boys from the first, Rhaegar's trap, laid down patiently over long years, and the man who had built the whole northern half of that trap, who had married his own daughter into the plot and threaded his sons through the web of it, was Rhaegar Stark of Winterfell. That was the reason he had summoned him south, not to answer for a wayward son's siege in the Stormlands, to stand in the throne room and confess to the architecture of it all. Rhaegar Stark, who had bent every knee he owned and married off every child he had to make his ancient house great, stood upon the flags of the throne room and demanded trial by combat, as was his right by law and by long custom. He was told with perfect and unfailing courtesy that fire would be his judge. It happened exactly as it had happened once before, in another turning of the very same world. The same green-robed pyromancers, the same eager green flame licking up from the floor, the same suit of heavy steel plate hung glinting above the fire on its chain, the same single word spoken calmly down from the height of the throne. The only difference in it, the only one that signified anything at all, was that this time the man cooking slowly inside the armor was the king's own truest ally, had done not one single thing against his king in the whole of his life, and died wholly and utterly bewildered, unable to his very last choking breath to comprehend what it was that he was being burned alive for. Aerys watched the whole of it, and was satisfied, and was calm.
Then he dictated the next order, to be carried by ravens south to the camp in the mud at Storm's End. Eddard Stark, the heir now to Winterfell, whether he yet knew it or not, was to be taken under arrest by the Crown Prince's own hand and delivered in irons to King's Landing, to answer there for the black treason of his house. The Raven came down into the siege camp on a grey and windless morning. Rhaegar Targaryen broke the seal upon it and read his father's own cramped handwriting.
He read the order to arrest the man who had lately buried one brother in the mud, and now, without yet knowing it himself, an incinerated father in the capital. The man who had ridden faithfully at his side for a year and more. The one man in all that vast host who truly understood him. He read it through twice. Then he lifted his eyes across the guttering little campfire and looked at Eddard Stark, sat upon an ammunition crate with his greatsword laid flat across his knees, drawing an oiled cloth slowly and evenly down the length of the pale blade, not yet knowing that he had no living family left anywhere in the whole of the South, and that the man who had ordered them all into the ground had just signed a letter demanding this last one, too. The prince looked at him for a long time, at the honest bent head, at the patient hands, at the sword the man kept clean out of habit, because it was the one thing in his ruined life that would still do exactly what he asked of it.
And Rhaegar Targaryen, with 80,000 men asleep in the mud in a ring all around him, and a war he had never once wanted at his back, and the plain proof of his father's madness sitting in ink in his own 2 hands, sat very still, and did not call out for the guards, and began instead to make the single quiet decision that would turn all of this at last from a punitive campaign into the ending of his house's 300 years upon the throne. He did not hide it, and he did not manage it, and he did not let it wait until the morning. Rhaegar crossed the little ring of firelight and held the letter out to Ned Stark with his own hand, and while the man read it, he stood over him and told him the rest of it plainly, in a low voice, sparing nothing, that his father was dead, and how he had died, and by whose word it had been done.
He watched Eddard Stark read the order for his own arrest, and learn in the very same breath that Rickard Stark had been burned alive on the floor of the throne room by the king he had bent his knee to and married his children off to serve. And Rhaegar offered not one word in defense of his own house, and made no excuse at all for the blood of it, because there was none that could honestly be made, and a lesser man would have reached for one anyway. "I will not enforce it," Rhaegar said, when the silence had stretched long enough that it had to be broken. "You are free to go. Tonight, this hour. Take the best horse in the camp and ride north, and raise the whole strength of the north against the crown, if that is what this has bought. I will not send one man out after you, and I will not blame you for a single hour of it, not to my dying day. You have that from me, and you have it freely." Ned did not speak for a long time. The fire burned low between the two of them, and when at last he moved, he did not move toward the horses. He stayed. That was the hinge on which the whole of the war turned, though not one man in that camp understood it in the moment it happened. Because if the son of the man that Aerys Targaryen had just burned alive could still find it in himself to stand at the crown prince's side, then there was not a lord in all that vast host who could tell himself he could not do the same. Rhaegar called his commanders together in his tent that same night, and he said the sentence aloud for the first time in the whole of his careful life, quietly, the way a man at last sets down a stone he has carried a league too far. My father is not fit to reign. He has not been fit for a long time, and I have known it, and I have hidden it, and I have made excuses for it to better men than I am. I will not do it any longer. I mean to call a great council, and to say so before the whole of the realm, and to abide by what it answers. He looked round the ring of their faces in the lamplight. Any man who wishes to rise and leave this tent tonight and ride home to his own hall may do so with no dishonor and with no word of reproach from me, now or ever. I will not hold it against a living soul. But I would know who stands, and I would know it now. Jon Arryn rose to his feet first, before the prince had even finished speaking of it, the old man's knees cracking loud in the hush of the tent. Hoster Tully stood up second. Mace Tyrell waited, his soft eyes moving carefully round the whole of the tent to count exactly how many other men were already on their feet before he committed himself to anything. And then, the counting done, and the sum to his liking, he rose very quickly indeed, and with very great enthusiasm, as though he had meant to be first all along. So Rhaegar split his host in two. 40,000 he would take north with him to King's Landing under his own banner, to answer for his father's corpse and to claim the throne his father had fouled. 40,000 he left behind him in the mud under Jon Arryn's steady hand, to keep the iron ring closed tight around the walls of Storm's End, because he could not lift the siege, and he could not ride away to win a kingdom while he left Lyanna Stark sitting in a rebel's castle at his unguarded back. It was the correct decision. It was, at the very same time, the decision that would put a great many men into the cold ground who need never have gone there at all. And up on the wall of Storm's End, Robert Baratheon stood and watched half the enemy host below him form up into a long column and march away up the king's road and not come back. He was hollowed out now, thinner than he had been in all his life. But the mind behind his eyes still turned, and it turned now upon this.
Half as many men in the mud below him as there had been at dawn. No king in the capital any longer gave the orders, a whole realm turning its swords upon itself. And for the first time in 14 long months of stone and hunger, Robert Baratheon began, very quietly, somewhere down beneath his ribs, to believe that he could win. Tywin Lannister had offered his only daughter to a prince and been refused to his face. He had offered his heir up to the white cloaks of the Kingsguard, and then had that same heir stolen away from him by a jealous king for the sole purpose of robbing a great lord of his son and his succession both. He had poured out 20 years of a lion's service upon the realm and been handed back for it, again and again, the back of a mad king's hand, until the trading of insult was the only coin that still passed in either direction between the throne and the rock. He had watched the whole of this war, from its first day to this one, from the comfort of a chair.
But his son Jaime stood now in a white cloak at the very foot of the Iron Throne, in a city that a victorious prince was even now marching hard upon. And that one fact changed the whole of the arithmetic. Because whatever else came to pass, when Rhaegar arrived at his father's gate to settle accounts, Tywin Lannister was not the man to sit idle in the west and let his golden boy be burned, or bargained away, or simply forgotten in the rubble of a falling dynasty. And so, at long last, after 20 years of swallowing it, Tywin Lannister was handed the one thing he had never quite been given before: a reason to leave Casterly Rock. He came down upon King's Landing ahead of the prince, with 12,000 men marching at his back, and he stood before the gate and declared himself, loudly and for all to hear, for the king. And Aerys, who had been paranoid enough to burn a loyal warden of the North alive upon the mere suspicion of a plot that had never once existed outside his own skull, but was not, when it came to it, paranoid enough to recognize the one true enemy riding straight and open at his gate, believed him. Down in the throne room, Varys threw himself flat upon the flags before the throne, and all but shrieked that it was a trap, that the lion had never in the whole of his cold life forgiven one single slight, that to open the gate to Tywin Lannister now was to open the gate to death itself and hold it wide. The king would not hear it. He had spent 2 long years being told over and over that his most loyal men were secret traitors to him, and being proven right about it just precisely often enough to make him wrong about everything else that mattered. And somewhere in the depths of that madness, he had simply lost the last of his ability to tell the difference between a man who had come to save his life and a man who had come to end it. So Aerys Targaryen threw wide the gates of his own city to the one man in all of Westeros who had never in his life forgiven any wrong done to him. And he did it for no better reason than that Tywin Lannister was not the particular enemy that Eris happened to be imagining on that particular day. Tywin's men took the Red Keep in a single night, gate by gate and hall by hall, and did it so quietly that half the court woke to find the war already over and lost. And Aerys Targaryen, run to ground at the last in his own throne room, ringed about by golden lions, cornered and gleeful, and shining wet about the eyes, and more entirely and perfectly himself than he had been in years, gave at last the order he had been holding back in reserve for 20 years. The order that the whole hidden network of pyromancers' caches beneath the city had been built and seeded and waited only to answer. Burn them all. And the green-robed men bowed low to their king, and turned, and went out to go and do it. And Sir Jaime Lannister, 17 years old, sworn with his own mouth before gods and men and his brothers of the Kingsguard, to give his life to guard the life of his king, stood at the foot of the Iron Throne, with the wildfire seated thick beneath a sleeping city of 500,000 living souls, and had, by his own reckoning ever after, about 4 seconds in which to decide exactly what kind of man he was going to be for the whole of the rest of his life. Rhaegar rode into a city that had not burned. He came up through streets that were quiet and whole and full of living people, past a common folk who did not yet have the smallest notion of how near they had all come to being nothing but gray ash blowing off the water, and in through the gates of the Red Keep, and into a throne room where his father's own sworn Kingsguard sat upon the stone steps below the Iron Throne. Not upon the throne, upon the steps below it, with a bloodied longsword laid flat across his knees, and a look upon his young face that no boy of 17 years should ever have had cause to wear. Tywin Lannister stood a little way off from him, at a polite and carefully measured distance, his hands folded before him, waiting with a patience he had earned over 20 years to be thanked for all of this as the man who had authored it. Rhaegar looked upon his father's body for a long while.
Eris lay where he had fallen, at the foot of the ugly throne he had spent a lifetime defiling, with a white knight's clean sword stroke in his back, and the last of his laughter frozen somehow into the open shape of his mouth. Then Rhaegar crossed the floor of the hall, and he did not go to Tywin Lannister. He went to the boy sitting on the steps. He reached down and took Jaime Lannister's hand in his own and drew him up onto his feet, and he thanked him, loudly and clearly, and in the full hearing of every lord and every bannerman crowded into that great hall, for the saving of 500,000 innocent lives from the fire.
It was the single most consequential act of the whole of Rhaegar's reign, and he made it in under a minute, and he made it entirely upon instinct. Because a king's word, spoken in that hall, in that hour, in front of all those witnesses, made Sir Jaime Lannister a hero for the rest of the ages, instead of an oathbreaker and a kingslayer, and made Tywin Lannister, who had ridden the whole length of the realm expressly to own this one exact moment, into nothing more than an onlooker standing off at the edge of it, his thanks left unspoken in his mouth, his hands still folded before him, and not one man in all that hall so much as turning to look his way. Rhaegar did not crown himself. He called instead the great council that he had promised on the road, and he called it at Harrenhal, where the whole of this ruin had first begun, where a crown of blue winter roses had once come to rest in the lap of a northern girl. The very council that his own father had torn 4 great houses apart to prevent him from ever summoning. And it confirmed him, without one single voice raised against him in the whole of that vast hall, because there was no longer anyone left alive who wished to argue the matter, nor anyone left to argue it on another's behalf. Rhaegar of House Targaryen, first of his name, took up a throne standing over the corpse of his own father, having won at the very last every single thing that he had ever wanted in his life, by the worst and bloodiest road that any man could ever have been made to walk to reach it. And the very first act of his reign, before ever he sat that throne, was to send a raven flying south to Jon Arryn in the mud outside Storm's End, ordering him to bring the siege to an end on any terms at all that he could contrive to get. Jon Arryn carried the terms up to the foot of the wall himself. He stood below the battlements in the wind off the sea, and he called up to the boy he had raised as his own, and he offered him everything a man could be offered: his life, his ancient title, his castle entire, a full and unconditional pardon under the new king's own seal, the whole of the last 2 years wiped away as though they had never been, for one girl. Robert Baratheon stood on the high wall above the man who had raised him, gaunt and grey and hollow-cheeked from 14 months of siege bread, and then of far less than bread. And he refused it, not out of any strategy, for there was none left to serve. He refused, because to hand her over now, to take up the pardon and walk out of that gate into the clean sun, would mean that Brandon Stark had died in the mud below her window for nothing at all. That the 11 men killed on the King's Road had died for nothing. That the whole of the last 2 terrible years had not been a rescue in the end, but only ever a crime. And Robert Baratheon had never once, in the whole course of his life, been able to go on drawing breath while knowing himself to be wrong. Jon Arryn rode back down to the camp with his old face gone the color of a winter sky, and he told Eddard Stark that there was no longer any road left in all the world by which his sister might come out of that castle alive, save through the gate itself, and that the gate was not going to open. They ate the horses first. Then, when the horses were gone, the dogs, and at the last of it they ate the rats, and Stannis Baratheon counted out every single ounce of all of it in a ledger, in his own cramped hand, by candlelight. He was 19 years old, and he was the sole reason that anyone at all inside those walls was still drawing breath. He rationed the whole castle down to the very knife edge of starvation with the precise and joyless patience of a counting house clerk and the face of a man walking calmly to his own execution. And he did not spare himself so much as one crumb more than he allowed the lowest and meanest man of the garrison. And he did not once miss a single tally, not morning and not evening, in all the long gray months of the great hunger. And to Lyanna Stark he gave a full share, every single day, without fail. Out of a garrison that was slowly starving to death around him, out of stores that he was by then measuring by the spoonful and the crumb, he set her portion aside first, and whole and untouched, because she was a hostage, and a hostage was a guest beneath the roof, and a guest beneath the roof stood under the roof's protection. And Stannis Baratheon would very much sooner have lain himself down in the frozen yard and died than become the kind of man who let a guest starve inside his walls. She watched him do it, day upon day, month upon grinding month, and she never once thanked him for a mouthful of it. And he never once, in all of that time, so much as expected her to. Robert found him down in the cellar in the dark, counting the very last of the stores by a guttering stub of candle, and demanded to know why in the name of all 7 gods he was still feeding the woman a full share while grown men wasted in the yard. And Stannis Baratheon, for the first and the only time in the whole of this long ruin shouted, "I have held these walls for 2 years." His voice cracked and rang off the low stone. "For a crime, your crime. I have stood on that wall and watched men I grew up beside die of hunger in that yard. Men I knew, Robert, men who dandled us both as babes for the sake of a girl who hates the very sight of you and of me and of everything our name has ever laid a hand upon. And I have done every hour of it because it was my duty. And a man's duty does not stop to ask him whether he happens to be enjoying it. He was breathing hard, his fists shaking at his sides. You have never done one single thing in the whole of your life for any reason under heaven except that you wanted to. Not one thing, not ever, and you never will, not if you live to be 100. Robert had no answer for it. He stood there in the failing candlelight with his mouth open, and not one word came out of him.
It was the exact moment that Stannis Baratheon stopped loving his brother, and he would never, in all the years left to him, manage to get it back. And the terrible thing was that both of them knew it in the very same breath down there in the dark. That night Lyanna Stark sent for Robert, and she asked him, calmly and without the smallest heat, as though the two of them were passing an idle remark about the weather off the grey sea, to open the gate and to let her simply walk out through it. And she offered him, in exchange, the only thing that she had left in the wide world to trade. She would tell the whole of the realm that he had treated her with honor, that her brother had died in a fair duel, fairly offered and fairly met, that Robert Baratheon was not, in truth, the monster that the histories were already sharpening their quills to make of him for all the ages to come. She was offering to lie for him, to spend the whole of her own good name, every last coin of it, in the buying back of his. It was the nearest thing to a genuine kindness that any living soul had shown Robert Baratheon in 2 long years. And Robert looked at the woman he had pulled down a kingdom to have for his own, and he understood, with the terrible, rare clarity that came to him so seldom and always far too late to be of any use, that she was doing this for one single reason and no other, so that his men would stop dying of hunger in the yard below her window. And he said no. Then he went down into the cold yard, and he gave the order to arm. They came out at first light, 900 starving men, out through the gate into a host of 40,000. It was not a battle, and it had never once been meant to be one.
It was Robert Baratheon, making the men who had bled 2 years for him a last gift, a death upon their feet, in the open air, with a sword in hand, instead of a death lying down in the dark of a black cellar, with their ribs standing out through their skin. Every last one of them understood precisely what it was that he was offering them, and every last one of them walked out through that gate behind him into the dawn regardless, because whatever else Robert Baratheon had ever been across the whole of his ruinous life, men had always followed him. Stannis was not among them. Robert had locked his brother into the maester's tower the night before, with his own 2 hands, turning the great iron key in the lock himself, while Stannis stood rigid and silent on the far side of the door, understanding perfectly well why it was being done to him, and hating every part of it. It was the only holy and unambiguously good thing that Robert Baratheon did in the whole of the story. And he did it without a single word, and he never once spoke of it again to any living soul. Then he went out into the host, as though the last 2 years had never happened at all. He was not trying to cut his way free, and he was not trying to win the field, because there was no winning of it left anywhere for him. He was looking for one man, and one man only. He carved a long red road straight through the heart of the press toward the great royal banner, the war hammer swinging in its wide flat arcs, men falling away, broken to either side of him. And at the far end of that road, he found the man that he had come out through the gate to find. And Rhaegar Targaryen wheeled his horse about to meet him, and then swung down out of the saddle to stand and face him on his own 2 feet in the mud, because it was owed, and because he was the kind of man who paid what was owed. Hammer against sword, in the churned bloody mud below the walls of Storm's End. The one fight that the whole of the realm had been waiting to see, since a crown of blue winter roses first came to rest in a girl's lap upon the tourney field at Harrenhal, 2 entire lifetimes ago now. It lasted a very long time, and for a long stretch in the middle of it, it went the wrong way entirely. Robert was half dead of hunger, and it did not seem to make the smallest difference. The hammer came crashing down, and Rhaegar's shield split apart beneath it like kindling, and the second blow caught the prince a glancing ruin across the shoulder, and drove him down onto one knee in the mud. And every man watching in all that host who loved the new-made king felt his own heart stop dead in his chest, because Robert Baratheon stood over him then in exactly the way he had once stood over Brandon Stark, and lifted the great hammer high for the blow that ends things. But Rhaegar Targaryen was the second best sword in all of Westeros, and he had spent 2 full years hating every single thing about this war, down to the marrow. And the arms of a man starved to a skeleton fail him a half heartbeat sooner than the arms of a fed man do. The hammer came down at last into the empty churned mud where the prince had knelt a moment before, and Rhaegar's sword came up. They pulled Robert Baratheon out of the press, still breathing, though only barely, and it was Ned who reached him first of all. Ned who got down into the cold mud and gathered his head up out of it and into his own arms. Robert's eyes had already stopped their seeing. He was drowning there on the dry land, broken open in 17 places at once, and he had one single thing left in him, and he chose to spend the whole of it on the one question that he had ever truly needed the answer to in all his life. Ned. His hand groped and found his friend's arm and closed on it. Did she ever at all? And Eddard Stark, who had ridden 2,000 leagues alone to a castle full of his enemies to try to save this man, who had in the end chosen against him, who had stood upon that very castle's wall and watched him kill Brandon in the mud below, who had never once, in the whole of his hard and honest life, told a single deliberate lie to any living soul, looked down into the ruined, dying face of the brother he had loved in everything but blood, and he said, "She did." Robert Baratheon smiled, and then he was gone, and Ned Stark went on sitting there in the freezing mud below the walls of Storm's End, holding him long, long after there was any reason left on the whole of the earth to go on holding him, having finally, at the very last, learned the exact and terrible price of the only lie that he would ever tell. Rhaegar did not go up himself, and he did not send a herald with a trumpet before him, because he understood, standing there in the taken yard, with the dead being carried past him on boards, that he was the very last thing on all the earth that the woman on the 4th floor would want to see come through her door. So he sent her brother, and he stayed below in the mud, and he waited like a man who knew exactly why he had to. Ned climbed 4 flights of a starving castle, past the empty larders and the men too weak with hunger to rise from where they sat against the walls. And he came to the door at the top of it, and he opened it, And he found her, 20 years old, 2 full years since she had last stood beneath an open sky, thin as a drawn knife, and standing very straight in the middle of the bare room, and entirely, terribly composed, in a way that frightened him a great deal more than any weeping or any wildness ever could have. The first thing that she said to him was not thank you. Is father dead too, then? It was not a question, and there was no hope anywhere in it. Her eyes did not leave his face for an instant. And Brandon? Say it, Ned. Say all of it, out loud. I have been guessing at it through that window for 2 years, and I am done with the guessing now. Say it plainly, so that I know the true shape of the thing at last. So he said it, the whole of it, standing there in the doorway, with the cold sea wind coming up the stairs at his back. Brandon, dead in the mud, directly below the very window she had been standing at. 2 years gone now. Rhaegar, their father, was burned alive on the stone floor of the throne room by the king he had served and flattered and married his children away to please. Robert, dead not one single hour past, out in the field below them, with Ned's own 2 arms wrapped around him at the very end of it. Aerys, dead in King's Landing, with a sworn white knight's sword buried in his back, and 40,000 more men besides, in the cold ground, in a long line between this castle and the Trident. Every last one of them, one way or another, near hand or far, on account of a single decree with her name written into the heart of it. A decree that she had never once laid her own eyes upon until the hour after it had already become the law. Lyanna Stark listened to the whole of that long and terrible tally without moving so much as a single finger. She did not weep. She did not sway on her feet. She did not once look away from her brother's face while he spoke. And when he had reached the end of it, she asked him the one question that was left in all the wide world still worth asking. And what do they want from me now? On the way back down the stair, she stopped before the locked door of the maester's tower, and she sent for the key, and she turned it in the lock with her own hand, and Stannis Baratheon stepped out of the dark of it into a castle that had fallen, and a family that was wholly gone, and a lordship that he had never once in all his life wanted. Lord of Storm's End at 19, by the sole and bitter right of being the one Baratheon in the whole of the affair who had told the plain truth every single day of it, and the one man that not a living soul had ever troubled to listen to. The whole of the royal host was crowded into that yard below. Lords and belted knights, and common men whom 2 hard years of siege had taught to hate the very stones of this place, and every soul yet standing upon them. And Lyanna Stark, who had not spoken a word of thanks to one living person in 2 entire years, turned to that grim and silent boy in the full sight of the assembled host, and she thanked him, loudly and clearly and slowly, so that every single man in that crowded yard heard every single word of it. She thanked Lord Stannis Baratheon for his hospitality and for the great honor with which he had kept her, his guest, safe and whole and fed beneath his roof. It was the first political act of her life, and it saved the whole of House Baratheon at a stroke, because there was not now one lord in all that yard who could bring himself to put a rope around the neck of the man that the queen-to-be had just named, in front of the entire world, an honorable host. It was the least romantic scene in the whole of the long war, and it was, without any question at all, the best one. 2 exhausted people in a tent, with a marriage contract lying flat on the plank table between them, that not one of the 2 of them had signed. Both of them had had the whole course of their lives written out for them in another man's ink, by the very same mad hand. Both of them had lost the whole of their families to the writing of it. And now here the 2 of them sat, across a rough table in the low, guttering lamplight, looking at each other like a pair of strangers who had survived the very same shipwreck and washed up, half drowned, on the very same cold stretch of sand. Rhaegar did not flatter her, and he did not lie to her, because he could see plainly enough that both would be nothing but wasted breath between them. "I do not love you," he said. "I want you to hear it first from me, and to hear it plainly, so that no man can ever come to you later and tell you otherwise, and be believed. I crowned you at Harrenhal because you were the finest rider on that whole field, and every man there with working eyes could see that it was so, and I am not sorry that I did it, though it has since cost the both of us everything that either of us ever had." He was quiet for a moment. "And the realm needs a Stark queen now more than it has needed anything at all in 300 years. The North has buried a father and a brother in this war. If a daughter of Winterfell wears the crown, then the North holds, and the peace holds with it. If she does not, then we do the whole of this again in a single generation, and worse." Lyanna sat and waited for the rest of it, for the part where he told her, gently, that it was all already arranged, already necessary, already long since decided over her head. It did not come. Instead, Rhaegar Targaryen, the first man in 20 years to do it, the first since a time before she could rightly even remember, asked her. He did not command her.
He did not arrange it around her. He did not decree it down from a height while she stood small below it. He asked her, and he plainly meant the asking. And then he said the one thing that no one in the whole of her life had ever once said to her. And if your answer to me is no, then you may take the best horse in this camp tonight and ride north with your brother in the morning, and I will find some other road to walk. And I will never speak one word of this again, to you or to any living soul. The choice is yours alone. It belongs to no one else. I give you my word upon it, before the old gods and the new. And Lyanna Stark sat in that tent and discovered, to her own great bewilderment, that being asked was somehow worse than being taken had ever been, because being taken was a thing that had been done to her, and she could hate it clean and whole and lay the whole weight of it on the hand that did it. But this, whatever came after this, whatever she chose now, was going to be hers, and hers alone, forever. She took a single night over it, and in the gray light of the morning she came back into the tent with a yes, and with a list. She would marry him. The North would hold. There would be no second war. And in exchange for all of it, Stannis Baratheon kept Storm's End, and his head, confirmed and pardoned under seal. Elia Martell's children kept their names, and their father, and their every place in the line of succession, untouched. Dorne was to be made whole, publicly, by the crown, before the whole of the realm, in a manner that Doran Martell himself would judge to be sufficient. And Eddard Stark was to be Warden of the North, with no Southron marriage ever bound upon him, not now and not in all the years to come. Rhaegar read the list through twice in silence.
And he understood, with something very near to horror climbing slowly up the back of his throat, that the girl his father had dragged the whole width of a continent in chains to hand to him had just, in the space of a single sleepless night, negotiated a peace far cleaner and far more durable than any of his seasoned lords had managed in 2 full years of blood and mud, and that she had done it entirely alone, by the light of one candle, and that she had priced her own body out to the very last copper, precisely, and without once flinching from the sum of it. The crown's piece rode south to Sunspear, and Oberyn Martell wanted no part of it. His position was a simple one, and it was entirely correct, and that was the very worst thing about it. His sister had been unmade by a mad king for no reason under heaven but to clear an empty space in a marriage bed for a girl out of the frozen north. And now the girl out of the north was to be crowned a queen over the whole realm, and no list of pretty concessions inked onto a length of parchment, however generous, however clever, changed one single word of that plain and ugly and unforgivable fact. Rhaenys and Aegon have a claim, he said, pacing the length of the cool shaded hall like something caged, and a better one now than the northern woman's children will ever hold. And every spear in all of Dorne to press it home for them. Elia is a princess of Dorne, brother, not a chair, to be carried out of a room, and then carried back into it again, whenever it happens to suit the whim of a Targaryen. So we declare, we press the claim, we make them pay for what was done to her, in the one coin they understand, the way they would have made us pay it for 1/10 of the offense.
Doran Martell, who had spent 2 long years sitting perfectly still in his chair while the whole of the realm called him a coward to his face and behind his back and in songs, let his brother run all the way to the end of it and did not interrupt him once. Then he said, very quietly, every single item upon that list came from the northern girl herself, not from the crown, not from Rhaegar's hand, from hers. She wrote it in a tent, in one night, alone, and every line of it, every one, protects our sister and our sister's children. He let that settle into the silence of the hall. A woman does not do such a thing for a rival that she means to bury. And then Doran Martell did the one single thing that not one other man in the whole of this long and bloody story had ever once thought to do. Because he alone, among all of them, understood that the wronged party ought to be given a vote in the matter of her own wrong. He put it to Elia herself.
She read the terms through slowly, with her own eyes, in the cool green shade of the water gardens, with her 2 children shrieking and splashing in the pale pools behind her. Her children kept their names. They kept their places in the line of succession. They kept their father. Her house was to be made whole again in the eyes of all the realm. And the woman who had replaced her in the marriage bed had written out every last word of it with her own hand, and had bought the whole of it with her own body, and had asked in all of it for not one single thing for herself. Lyanna Martell had more cause to burn the whole of the world down to grey ash than any living soul in all of Westeros. She set the parchment down gently in her lap, and she looked out at the still water for a long, long while. And then she said the one plain sentence that saved the 7 kingdoms. She was 15. Nobody asked her either. Dorne did not rise. The spears stayed in their racks in the armories, and Oberyn Martell rose from his seat and walked out of that hall without another word, and did not speak so much as a single sentence to his sister for a year and a day after. So the peace held, and the price of the holding of it was written down into the very law of the land at the Great Council, plain and permanent for all the ages yet to come to read. Rhaenys and Aegon Targaryen, though born of a marriage that a king had struck down, were confirmed true-born and confirmed in the succession entire. And Aegon, 3 years old, dark of hair and Dornish of blood, was named and proclaimed the heir to the Iron Throne. Rhaegar signed it into law with his own hand, because Lyanna's terms had required it of him, and because it was, quite simply, just. And then he went back to his books, back to a prophecy about a prince that was promised, and a song of ice and fire that he had believed in with the whole of his heart, since he was a lonely boy, reading alone in a great library. And he began, very quietly, in the locked privacy of his own study, to turn over and to reconsider which of his two sons the old song had ever truly meant. She was wed in the great sept of Baelor to a king that she did not love, in front of a realm that had killed the whole of her family to put her there. And then she went and became something that not one soul had expected of her, least of all she herself. She was extraordinary at it. She still rode in the yard when the whole of the court thought that a queen ought never to be seen doing any such thing. She sat the small council and made the grey old men gathered round its table hear her out and be the better for the hearing. She was the one single person left alive upon the earth who could tell Rhaegar Targaryen to his face that he was wrong about a thing, and be listened to, and be heeded. And she spent the whole of her queenship, all of its weight, all of its long reach, upon the one thing in all the world that she had ever truly cared about. She made the crown's own law say, out loud and in ink, and for all the years to come, that a betrothal made without the true consent of the one being betrothed was void and worthless, and no betrothal at all, anywhere in the 7 kingdoms. They called it the Queen's Law, and it passed. It passed because there was not one lord in all that great hall who could rise to his feet and look Lyanna Stark full in the face. Lyanna Stark, whose own father and brother and betrothed were every one of them in the cold ground over precisely and exactly this, and cast his vote against it. And it was a cage, with the door left standing wide open, which is a far subtler and a far colder cruelty than ever the one that Robert had built for her out of black stone. She had a husband who respected her deeply and did not know the first true thing about her. She had a court that adored her, that adored a version of her they had invented whole out of a 2-year siege and a crown of blue winter roses. A Lyanna spun out of songs, a Lyanna who had never for one moment actually existed. She had a brother in the far distant north, whom she saw perhaps once in every 3 years. And she had a private list, one that she carried always, and kept always, and never once showed to a single living soul. Brandon, and Rickard, and Robert, and 40,000 nameless men, that she tallied over in the dark of the night, the exact way that Stannis Baratheon had once tallied his dwindling stores in a cellar. She was 21 years old, and she had never once, in the whole of her life, done a single thing that she had not first been maneuvered and moved and steered into the doing of. Not one thing. Not even the good ones. Not even the Queen's Law itself. Then her time came upon her, and she survived the birthing of the child. For this is the one turning of the world in which she lives through it whole. And the boy came out of her, silver-haired and violet-eyed, and utterly unmistakable, a dragon, down to the very last lash of him. And Lyanna was still lying there upon the birthing bed, still catching her ragged breath, the child not yet even washed clean of the blood of her, when she heard her husband's voice come low and calm and certain from the doorway of the chamber, telling the maester the child's name, Aegon. His first son was 4 years old, alive and well and safe in the warm gold sunlight of Dorne, and named Aegon. And Rhaegar Targaryen had just, standing in a doorway, without one word of it to her, named this second son Aegon too, because the prophecy required an Aegon. And Rhaegar had sat alone in his study, among his books and his scrolls, and decided, entirely on his own, and asking no one, which of his 2 sons the old song had always truly meant. Lyanna Stark turned her head slowly upon the pillow and looked at her husband standing there in the door, and she understood. 2 full years too late to do the smallest thing with the understanding that the Mad King had not, after all, been the only Targaryen who ever wrote out the whole of a living person's life for them in advance, and never once thought that he might ask. 3 years on, Eddard Stark rode south for his nephew's naming day, and the long road that he rode ran the whole way through a kingdom that was, against every reasonable expectation, entirely whole. And it genuinely was whole. That was the very thing that he could not get his mind to close around. Rhaegar was a good king, better than Robert would ever in 100 years have been, by any honest measure a man cared to take it, and better than Ares by a distance so vast that it beggared the telling. The North was bound fast and firm to the throne. Dorne was placated, and its wronged princess made whole again before the realm. The Stormlands were held, and well held, by the single most honest man in all of Westeros, who was quietly and entirely without any credit for it, the finest Lord Paramount in the whole realm, and whom not one living soul could quite bring themselves to like. There had been no sack of King's Landing, no queen lying dead upon a cold stone floor, no small children spitting upon a Lannister's spears in the dark, no mountain that rides, No red day upon the trident, no rebellion at all, ever.
Ned Stark rode south through green fields that no army had ever put to the torch, past whole villages that still stood, past small laughing children who had never once in their lives heard the sound that a war makes. And he searched himself the whole long way down for one single clean thing to feel about any of it, and he could not, for all his trying, find even one. He found his sister in the godswood of the Red Keep, beneath a great heart tree that had no face carved into it, and there at the last the two of them said aloud to each other the things that had been waiting 20 long chapters to be said. She told him she had already read the histories that the maesters were even now busy setting down: Robert's Folly, the Fall of the Mad King, the Queen's Law, and that in every single one of them, in all of them without one exception, she was a reason and a cause and a prize and a symbol and a crown of roses, and never once, upon any page of any one of them, a person. And then she said the thing that the whole of it, from the very first line, had been building the long, slow way toward. Every man in Westeros was ready to burn the whole world down for me, Ned. Father, Robert, Aerys, Rhaegar, every last one of them would have set the entire realm alight to have me, or to save me, or to keep me, or to make use of me. And not one of them, not one in all of it, ever once asked me what it was that I wanted. She looked at him, and her eyes were dry and very clear and very steady. You rode 2,000 miles to a castle full of your own enemies, with no army at your back, and no plan in your head, and no leave from any living man. And the only thing you did when you finally got there, the only thing, was ask me what I wanted. You couldn't give me any of it. You knew that you couldn't before ever you asked it, and you asked me anyway. You were the only one who ever asked.
Then they brought the two babies out into the bright sun of the yard for the naming. Elia Martell's Aegon, 4 years old now, dark of hair and dark of eye, and Dornish through to the very bone, the lawful and thrice confirmed heir to the Iron Throne, holding tight to his mother's hand in the light. And Lyanna Stark's Aegon, 3 moons old, silver of hair and violet of eye, asleep against his own mother's shoulder. The second son, the one that his father believed, in the deep and locked and private country of his own heart, the whole of the world itself had been promised. Across the width of the yard, in the cool shade of a colonnade, Oberyn Martell stood and watched the king. He watched Rhaegar Targaryen's eyes travel for just one single moment too long to the younger boy and not to the elder one. And Oberyn Martell began, very slowly, in the shade, to smile, because he had just been handed, at the very long last, after the whole of it, a war that he could win in a single generation, and win completely, without ever once drawing a single spear from its rack. And Eddard Stark stood beside his sister in the warm and peaceful sunlight with a small sleeping nephew cradled on either arm, one of them dark and one of them silver, one of them lawful and one of them promised. And he looked down into the two small, untroubled, sleeping faces of the boys who would one day be made to settle between the two of them the very thing that their fathers and their grandfather had settled in fire and in mud and in 2 long years of hunger. And he understood at last, standing there in that whole and peaceful and sunlit yard, that the realm had not, in the end, for all of it, avoided its war at all. It had only, at the most terrible cost, agreed upon a date, standing there in that whole and peaceful and sunlit yard, that the realm had not, in the end, for all of it, avoided its war at all. It had only, at the most terrible cost, agreed upon a date.